okay? All right, great. Here one more time. So I was in Venezuela from the 2nd to 22nd of December. I was previously there, and that was during the time of the legislative elections that just took place. Previously, I was there in 2012 for the presidential election. In 2012, I took a class given by the electoral authority there, so I learned a lot about how the election system works. As you'll see later in the show, I was with a group that got to meet with one of the electoral rectors on the 5 branches of government in Venezuela. One branch is the electoral branch, and 5 people run that. And we met for about 2 hours with one of the rectors, and she explained the whole system, which I know a lot about already. But so basically, down there in the context of elections, Venezuela, democracy, and the future of Latin America. To get us oriented, here's Venezuela, Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, United States. See that clearly again. Just a brief topography. You can see the Andes Mountains stretching into the part of the country here. The Orinoco River, one of the great river systems of the world, really. And you'll see that an extensive system of rivers, large areas of plains, a lot of arable land, which unfortunately for various historical reasons is not used very productively. Jungle in the southern portion here. Indigenous populations concentrated here, here, and here. About 1.5% of the population. This is the modern political map. There are 23 states. This is just to show you where the population is concentrated. Basically, this strip here, up here to Maracaibo, Caracas, about 5 million people, 1 million people in Maracay, Valencia, Barquisimeto, a couple million in Maracaibo. Statistics say somewhere between 89 to 96% of the population is urban, which leads to the result that there are not enough people living in the countryside producing food. Now, before Europeans divided Venezuela into the political map we see now, people lived there in the Amazonas and other parts, and of course encountered Europeans. Columbus encountered Venezuela in, I think it was 1498 on its 4th voyage. And the people on the left, unfortunately, directly and indirectly, soon destroyed most of the indigenous population. This is an old map of the area. These are modern-day indigenous people living in different parts of the country. This is in the Amazon region. As I said, 1.5% of the population. But in 1992, they pulled the statue of Columbus down and changed Columbus Day to Day of Indigenous Resistance. That's the national holiday, Day of Indigenous Resistance. And they replaced the Columbus statue with a statue of Guayapuro, who lived in the Caracas Valley and fought against the Spanish. Eventually, they killed him and subdued the population. But he's, in recent decades, been held up as an example of resistance to intervention from outside. Then there was a colonial period. It was kind of a backwater because they didn't have a whole lot of gold and silver. They did grow cacao, chocolate, produced some copper, cattle, divided into large estates and aristocracy. But at the time of early 1800s, when the Napoleonic Wars were going on in Europe, the independence movement developed in Venezuela. One of the early leaders was Francisco de Miranda. He actually designed the modern flag of Venezuela, but he was unsuccessful, died in in prison, in Spanish prison. And the great historic leader that followed Miranda was Simón Bolívar. He was from an aristocratic family, large landownings, very wealthy. But as a youth, he had a tutor named Simón Rodriguez, who was a progressive and who actually had to leave the country because of trying to subvert the Spanish rule. Anyway, he instilled progressive values in Bolívar, and Bolívar became the military leader of the independence movement, which was started around 1810, finally concluded 1820, a little bit later. This was one of his chief lieutenants, Sucre. This is one of the famous battles of the Revolution, the city of La Victoria. The battle was going poorly for the independence forces, and the youth from the town armed themselves and joined the battle and turned the tide. It's a very famous battle, national holiday. They called it Youth Day, the anniversary of the battle, and usually the President of the Republic goes to the battlefield, and it's a national celebration to celebrate youth. This is Rivas, General Rivas, who won that battle. By the way, he eventually had to escape from the royalist forces, go out to the area of the plains. He was betrayed. They found him, cut off his head, boiled it in oil, put it on a stake at the gates to Caracas. This was a very bloody, terrible time of war. Probably 20% of the population died. A Venezuelan friend of mine said that it's still very present in the Venezuelan psyche. Then on the mother's side of his family, there was a family of 7 brothers who all died in the war. Caused refugee problems, all kinds of hardships for the population. Here's a tapestry showing Bolivar and Sucre in battle. This is the modern portrait of Bolivar, which was commissioned by President Hugo Chavez. They actually studied his skeletal remains and put together this reconstruction of what they believed he looked like. This is the surrender handing over the Spanish flag. At the time of the victory of the independence struggle, Venezuela and Colombia were one country. Bolivar tried to keep those two countries together. Eventually they split. There's another interesting battle and historic story. There was an important battle called the Battle of Vargas Swamp, and it was going poorly. Bolivar was apprehensive about the result. There was a cavalry officer who said, "But General, I, Rondon, have not fought yet." And Bolivar held it back. He had 14 lancers. It was a very small contingent. And the battle kept, the Spanish brought in fresh cavalry, and Bolivar was really afraid they were going to lose it. Rondon, Juan Jose Rondon said, "But General, Rondon hasn't fought yet." And he said, Rondon joined the battle, and rather miraculously, these 14 lancers turned the tide of battle, and they won this important battle. And this is the monument to that. And Venezuelans look to the story of Rondon as being indicating a national characteristic they believe they have. Is when the going gets tough, if they reach down deep, that they can do extraordinary things. And this is a battle of that actually sealed the victory for the independence of Colombia and then led to the independence of Venezuela. This is the national hero, Simón Bolívar. This is a picture I took in the plaza in central Caracas. Every town and city has a statue of Bolivar and a Bolivar plaza. And in the time after Bolivar, in the 1800s, there was a series of civil wars, federal war, which led to the more or less the basic political divisions of the country today, and then leading into the 20th century, early in the petroleum. The Indians knew about petroleum and actually used it for a few things, but around in 1914, the oil industry got serious. There was a serious oil field developed. 14 transnational companies came in and exploited the oil. And oil for Venezuela, like for much of the world, has been a mixed blessing at best. Developing a country around oil for Venezuela has meant that the economy has developed in a very distorted fashion. They experience what's called by economists Dutch disease, where a single commodity of high value distorts the economy in one way by raising the price of the currency, which makes exports expensive, so they become dependent on imports. And this happened to Venezuela in a very classic fashion. It's a country where very little agricultural product is produced, very little manufacturing. They send out oil and buy pretty much everything else. And it's a huge problem, and a problem that's continuing today and actually affected the election results in the recent legislative elections. This is one of the oil fields in Lake Maracaibo. You'll see this is 2014, and the figures are actually higher now. Venezuela has more oil than any country in the world, and also is about number 6 in natural gas. They actually have about 20% or more of all the proven oil reserves in the world, and the figures actually rise every year. They've got lots and lots of oil. This is the President Maduro meeting with oil workers. The oil industry was nationalized in around 1976, formally nationalized, but it actually remained quite independent. It was run by oil executives in collusion with the 14 corporations, and most of the money was the Venezuelan people never saw it, let's say that. Now, in the 1950s, this young man was born. This is Hugo Chavez. He was born in the plains area of the country in the state of Barinas. He really wanted to be a baseball player. There was a major leaguer named Chavez, a Venezuelan, very successful pitcher. Chavez was a pitcher. He wanted to play baseball. The university in the city near where he lived did not have a baseball team. He ended up going to the military academy because they had a ball team. And he played baseball at least a little bit throughout his life. Now, while he became a young military officer, the neoliberal period, which affected Latin America, very adversely took place. The IMF, in collusion with the neoliberal government, imposed austerity measures, and at some point the population of Caracas had just had enough. They raised the bus fares, and people just said, enough, we're not doing it. And it ended up in all kinds of violence in the streets, government repression. This was 1989. Excuse me, 1982. Thousands of people were shot down in the streets, buried in mass graves. It was a very traumatic experience called the Caracazo, and it really formed the consciousness of a generation. There's a mother mourning for her child. So meanwhile, Chavez was a young military officer in his 30s. So the military in Venezuela differs somewhat from many of the militaries in Latin America in that a lot of people of humble origin were able to reach officer status. And at this time, after the Caracazo, there was a lot of conspiring in the military against the government, and Hugo Chavez was one of the conspirators. He had his own movement, but there were others. But in 1992, he attempted a military coup in Caracas. He actually tried to grab the president, take the presidential palace, but he failed in that operation. And he decided to surrender, and he said, in negotiations with the government, said, I will surrender if you let me speak on TV. So he went on TV and made a speech, very famous, and Venezuelans know this speech very well. And as part of the speech, he said that lamentably, for now, the objectives that we laid out have not been accomplished. When he said that for now they've not been accomplished, this kind of thing became mythical in Venezuelan society, in people's minds. The fact that he said for now left open the possibility that in the future, maybe something could change. Chavez was sent to prison. In fact, this is a prison photo here of him with his co-conspirators. He was sent to prison. While he was in prison, there was a constant presence of supporters outside the prison, and there was legal movements to try to free him, and he became very, very popular. In the next presidential election, one candidate, part of his platform was that he would pardon Chavez. He was elected, and just about immediately he pardoned Chavez. So Chavez was in prison for 2 years. When he got out of prison, he actually had all kinds of support, legal support, union support, and he decided to go into politics to see if the military route to power didn't work, try the electoral route. He started traveling around the country. He was a very intellectual man, extremely well-read, knew the geography and history of his country very well. He traveled throughout the country, meeting people and spreading the word of his vision of a more democratic, more just society. In fact, when he was a youth, he and his older brother, he has a brother, Adam, who was 1 year older, they made a pledge that they would spend their lives struggling for a true democracy. And he was then subsequently in 1998 was elected president of Venezuela. He ran on the platform of, if elected, he would promulgate a new constitution. His first act of office was to propose a public referendum asking the people of Venezuela if they wanted to call a constituent assembly to write a new constitution. That was overwhelmingly passed. And then during that year, there were assemblies, public assemblies called. People worked on the Constitution. In December of 1999, the new Constitution was ratified. He's holding in his hand. The Constitution is kind of omnipresent in Venezuela. You can buy it on the street. You'll often see people with little literature stands, and they'll sell little copies of the Constitution. I've bought several myself. This is the Caracas that Chavez came to rule in. And as I alluded to before, an interesting thing about Venezuelan government and other Latin American governments, I'm very familiar with Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, there's 4 branches of government. In Venezuela, there are 5 branches. The branches that we're familiar with. Of course, the executive, legislative, and judicial. Also, there's in Nicaragua, Honduras, Venezuela, and other countries, there's an elected branch of government. Now, hypothetically, the advantage to this, it gives you an independent organization to run elections, so you don't run into conflict of interest like we have in the United States, where elected partisan officials, attorney generals of states run elections. They have a 5th branch of government, which is very interesting, called People's Power. It's a branch of government that I don't totally understand, to be quite frankly. I keep reading the Constitution and trying to understand it and talking to people, and it's just kind of being worked out. One thing about the Constitution of Venezuela, it says that sovereignty ultimately lies in the hands of the people, and infers that no legislature, no executive, no administrative body can impose upon the natural rights of the people. The Constitution says that the people have the right to form a communal legislative body separate from the legislature. So right now, this is something that's being worked out. Also, they have legal officers to protect the rights of the people. So this is Chavez early in his presidency when he was still married. He was married twice. That was his youngest daughter. And Chavez brought basically a populist program to the country to bring people education, better standards of living, but not to overthrow the system as it existed. But he did institute many progressive programs that benefited people in health, education, transportation, and in many ways. But he found that even simple reforms were opposed. This is the old line military officers, and in 2002 they kidnapped him and had this man, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, swear himself in as president, abolished the legislature, abolished the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, particularly poor women, Caracas is in a valley, poor people live up the sides of the mountains, and hundreds of thousands of poor people, especially women, can get out of the streets demanding, the return of their president. And some loyal elements of the military rescued Chavez and brought him back to power within 2 days. Excuse me. So one thing that's controversial is that after this coup, Chavez didn't really do much to the people that kidnapped him and, subverted the Constitution and tried to overthrow the government. And many people have criticized Chavez for being so lenient with his enemies. So, partly as a consequence of this coup attempt, Chavez became more radical. He said, you can't even do simple things to improve the lives of people without these people, kidnapping you and trying to overthrow your government. He became somewhat more radical, and at some point, said that he was working towards a socialist society. One way he worked a better society, he set up organizations called misiones. One is for health care. Actually, the Constitution of Venezuela says that the people have the right to health care, comprehensive medical system paid for by the government. So he's just following the Constitution, free medical care. Unfortunately, when he tried to enlist Venezuelan doctors to provide care to the poor in the whole country of Venezuela, only about 10 doctors would do it. A country of probably 28 million at the time. So he made an association with Cuba, which turns out some of the best medical personnel in the world, and more than they need, and sends them around the world free to help the people from other countries to exchange petroleum for medical personnel, and set up a system called Barrio Adentro within the neighborhood. And it's a system starting with small neighborhood clinics working up to sophisticated hospitals and to provide free universal health care. I was in a hospital, a clinic in Venezuela, and asked, would you take care of my friend if he wasn't feeling good? And they said, what's wrong with him? I said, he's been having a little diarrhea. I just took him by the shoulder, took him back, saw a doctor, had lab tests, wrote a prescription. All they asked was his name and his age. Medical care is considered a human right. Also, the Constitution says that people have the right to dignified housing. Chavez, some years back, decided to start a housing program. It's called Mission Vivienda, Housing Mission. And last month, they delivered their 1 millionth home. And the goal is 3 million homes by the end of 2019. Many other, but they even have a government veterinary program because if you have animals on the street that are not healthy, it's not healthy for the human population either. So, very progressive things. Education is one of the focuses. The Constitution says that the people have the right to education to the limit of their abilities and aspirations. education's free through university level. I've met people going to medical school for free. But it all starts with getting rid of illiteracy. When Chavez took power, there was many illiterate people. They used the Cuban literacy system. Si se puede, yes you can. And some years back, the United Nations declared them free of literacy. And the literacy mission for adults is called Mission Robinson. And that's actually named after Chavez's tutor when he was in exile in Britain. He called himself Robinson. And I was in the park one day and I noticed this. This is adults who have learned how to read, formerly illiterate, who are now signing up for the second phase of the program to move them into, give them some training and move them into jobs. And then this was busy all day. It's just territory free of illiteracy. And while I was there, the Minister of Education happened to show up and interacted with the crowd and helped sign people up. Another project besides Mission Vivienda to build houses is a mission to refurbish houses that are already existing. Every week they paint and refurbish thousands of houses. It makes a huge difference. Chavez was very, very popular with fishermen. He banned trawling. All fishing is now artisanal fishing. And this is a House of the Socialist Fishermen. This is in a black fishing community on the coast. One fisherman said, look at all this fish I have. They're bringing in fish. He said, I was only out for 3 hours. I've got a lot of money here. So the fish are coming back. Stocks of fish are coming back because it's an industrial fishing industry. Now, a huge part of Hugo Chavez's story and his legacy, and it actually goes back to Bolivar. Bolivar believed in the integration of Latin America and the Caribbean. Bolivar was exiled several times. He was in Jamaica, he was in Haiti, and he said at one point that the United States of North America was destined to torment Latin America in the name of freedom, and that's turned out to be historically accurate. That's what has happened. Then Sandino in Nicaragua in the early 20th century wrote a piece called Bolivar's Great Dream, where he envisioned the union of Latin America and other leaders through Che Guevara. You've seen the Motorcycle Diaries, realizing we're really culturally and historically, we're one people and we're strong when we're together. Chavez was a great uniter, and he was instrumental in forming 4 important organizations: Petrocaribe, which provides Venezuelan oil to Caribbean basin countries on favorable terms. Basically, they pay half, and the rest they can pay for in 20 years at 1% interest. It frees up capital so they can do other development projects. I've seen in Nicaragua they've been able to build roads, etc. ALBA, Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America. It's a trade, cultural, interchange and mutual support group among the most progressive nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. UNASUR, which is a union of the South American countries. And CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. This is all the American nations except the U.S. and Canada, and which is meant to be an alternate to the Organization of American States, which has been dominated by the United States and has often played a negative role in Latin America. This is Petrocaribe. These are the countries served by Petrocaribe. And about 200,000 barrels of oil a day go to these various countries. ALBA. These are the ALBA countries: Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And these countries of the Caribbean: Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. And ALBA and Petrocaribe work closely together in social programs that spend over $100 million on social programs. ALBA, Petrocaribe, Solidarity. UNASUR, Union of South American Nations. All of these countries, of course, French Guiana is a colony. It's not a country, so, but all the rest of the countries are have this organization. For instance, they sent electoral observers to the elections in Venezuela. CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. A lot of people do know that Chavez was active in Latin America, but a lot of people do not realize how he was a proponent of solidarity with Africa. This is a facility I was able to visit, Center of African Wisdom, Institute for Strategic Investigation of Africa and its Diaspora. And you'll see how they use the south-oriented maps, south-to-south cooperation. This man was named Reynaldo Bolivar. He was the Assistant Minister for Africa. He's traveled to 44 African countries. I believe there's 54 African countries. He's brought back many works of art and culture. Venezuela provides aid to many of the poorest countries in Africa. Through adopted school programs, has helped 200,000 school children in Africa with textbooks, supplies, desks, etc. And they've got a great collection of African ceremonial and art objects. And this is what Chavez said about Africa. When we were children, we were told we have a motherland, and that motherland was Spain. However, we discovered later in our lives, as a matter of fact, we have several motherlands, and one of the greatest motherlands of all is Africa. We love Africa. Every day, we're much more aware of the roots we have in Africa. Racism is very characteristic of imperialism. Racism is very characteristic of capitalism. Katrina, indeed, has a lot to do with racism, no doubt about it. Hate against me has a lot to do with racism. Because of my big mouth, because of my curly hair, and I'm so proud to have this mouth and this hair, because it's African. The opposition that often referred to Chavez as a monkey or an ape. Here's just some pictures of Chavez. That's a very famous picture. He was a very happy, very humorous, very lively person. He had many friends. His friendship saved his life when, during the coup, after he was arrested, an officer was told by the president to execute Chavez. He happened to know Chavez liked him, didn't want to do it, and that probably his friendly nature saved his life more than once. There are murals all over Caracas and all over the country of Chavez. Here is with President Lula, former president of Brazil, Sean Penn, the actor, Danny Glover, the actor, with President Carter. President Carter said in the past, the Carter Center monitors elections around the world, said in the past and reiterated last year that Venezuela has the best electoral system in the world. Here is with the former president of Iran, and that's Chavez as we remember him. I was down in 2012 for his last election campaign. This is an official photograph of him. It rained like crazy. I was using Gary Payne's camera at the time and had to buy it from him because it got soaking wet. But I did take this picture. This picture of Chavez. He's playing air guitar and dancing in the rain with a band that recorded his theme song. Now, his doctors had told him he shouldn't go out there. He'd already had 2 cancer operations, and actually, a few months later, he would be dead. But there he is. This is an official photograph, and my daughter Ava was right down there, somewhere right down there in front. I was farther back. After one of his rounds of chemotherapy. So, not that long after he was reelected quite easily in 2012. He was in Cuba for a checkup, and they told him, "We need to operate right away. Your cancer's back." He flew back to the country. He said, "I got to go home and talk to my people." He went on TV, and he basically said, "If for any reason I can't continue as president, you need to vote for the vice president. He's the man for the job." meanwhile, stay unified. This is him in the hospital in Cuba with his 2 older daughters, his 3 daughters and a son. But due to respiratory infections post-operatively, he died. This was his funeral procession. A large section of the country went into severe mourning. This is President Maduro. That's President Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua and his wife Rosario Murillo, viewing the body of Chavez. Chavez is buried here. This was an old military school. It's where he launched his coup from. He used this as his headquarters. And now it is his final resting place, and this is his tomb. That's me, his tomb. And there's someone saying goodbye to Chavez. So Chavez had told his people, vote for Vice President Maduro. And Maduro was elected subsequent to Chavez's death, but only with a margin of victory of 1.5%. Most people thought he would win by 6 to 10%. Many Chavistas just didn't go out to vote. President Maduro, there he is with a copy of the Constitution, faced a really hard challenge, a country in mourning, an opposition after his election, though they have the best electoral system in the world. If I get time, I'll go into more detail about it, but it is the best electoral system in the world. The opposition didn't accept the results. The opposition candidate called for people to go into the streets, where it turned violent. Over 20 people were killed. It caused tremendous damage. Huge crisis for this new president. Subsequently, in the beginning of 2014, the opposition called for people to go into the streets to bring his exit, la salida, that he had to leave office. Basic technique was masked young men and some women went out to the streets, cut down trees, pulled debris into the streets, blocked major roadways, set things on fire, burned schools. They burned an entire university, caused billions of dollars of damage. Some Chavistas wanted to go out in the streets and fight with them. Maduro said, no, that's what they want. They want to provoke us, to give an excuse for foreign intervention. He finally brought the riots under control, but over 40 people were dead. The United States and some European countries criticized Maduro, said he was a human rights violator. He was killing his own people like Gaddafi did, which is far, far from the truth. So he's met, many crises. And then also the structural problems from being dependent on petroleum came home really bad. They've come home really bad. They're dependent 90-95% on petroleum exports for their foreign currency. The value of Venezuelan oil, when I was there, fell below $30 a barrel, and I believe oil fell yesterday. It's probably considerably lower than that now. They've lost 70-75% of that income. That's the income that funds the building the houses, free university education, universal health care, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big crisis. Meanwhile, ever since Chavez died and he was elected, the right wing think this is our chance to destroy this government and to go back to the situation we had in the past, where the oligarchy rules, poor people stay poor, and they've been unrelenting, with the cooperation of the United States, by the way. Media attack on Venezuela, psychological attacks on the people of Venezuela, social media attacks on Venezuela, an economic war attack on the currency. One company in Venezuela, this is something that left-wing people criticize Chavez for, should have nationalized this company. One company controls 70% of the processed food, the personal care items, soap, et cetera, and there's been induced shortages. Another thing, the structure of the petroleum industry, as I said, made it so virtually nothing is made in Venezuela. not much is produced. To uplift the people, Chavez instituted programs that provide very subsidized products to the people. So the prices were set very, very low for basic commodities. But this has caused a great problem because you just go over a very, very long border with Colombia, and those products are expensive. Therefore, there's a great impetus to get your hands on those products and take them across the border. So about 30% of the food that they produce, or much of it is bought, that they price low, is then stolen, goes across the border to Colombia. 40% of petroleum ends up in Colombia. The Colombian oil company doesn't even send anything near what's needed for that section of Colombia because they know the oil actually comes from Venezuela. And another problem with the government of Venezuela is oil is virtually free. You can fill up the tank of an SUV for pennies. I mean, they give it away. They basically give it away. Water is much more expensive than gasoline. So 40% of the gasoline goes across the border. Many people say Maduro should have changed this. He should have upped the price of gasoline. And he thought very seriously about it. But that causes problems too. Inflation's already high. It would raise the cost of other products. So the guy's been caught in a lot of binds. They want to get rid of him. And it's come to the culmination now where it led to the results of this election. So these, I told you, the garimbas, they call them, in the beginning of early 2014. This is what, and many of these people were receiving money from Colombia by way of the United States, and this is what they were doing in the streets. So we come to today, or a couple weeks ago, and there's just a lot of shortage. Another thing is, with the economy still largely in the hands of private companies, what the government does is they front the dollars from petroleum to these companies because they have to use dollars to buy things abroad. But the great impetus is for these companies to steal this money, sell it on the black market. The official exchange rate is 6.3 bolivars to the dollar. On the street, you change a dollar, you get 850 bolivars. So if you can get a dollar and change it, you have just exponentially increased your wealth. So these companies are stealing the money. So it's there's no easy fixes. So shortage of goods. Many of the goods are going across the border to Colombia. They don't have the petroleum income to buy as much, and the income they are funding is getting stolen. This is a line for the pharmacy. And to buy basic goods, many people stand in lines, and it's really become a serious problem. I stood in a line for 3 hours and 45 minutes, and it gets old. It does get old, and it wore people down. So the electoral system, this is the National Electoral Council, one of the 5 branches of government. 5 people run this organization. These are actually some of the most important people in the country. The most democratic country in the world. And I was with a group and we got to meet for 2 hours with one of these 5 people, one of the rectors. By the way, it's 4 women and 1 man. And this is Tanya, and she's a very important person in this country. So she spent 2 hours explaining to us how the system works. As I told you, I already was quite familiar. Just go into the history of why the ballots are set up. There are many political parties. This is a pre-Chavez ballot. Here she's showing a letter. Here's another big problem. The opposition, as I said, does not accept the results of elections in the past. 19 elections and Chavez just won. They said we're fraudulent. But she said, here's a letter we received from the secretary of the opposition coalition saying, hey, we're going to have our primary election. Would you guys run it for us and use your equipment and do it? Yeah, they're always going to change. So actually, Chavez supporters thought they were going to win this election. What they were worried about was more rioting in the streets, not that they were going to lose the election. And this is how the voting takes place. Voter ID in Venezuela is by thumbprint scan. Everybody has an ID and it has a thumbprint on it. 97% of people are registered to vote. You come in with your cedula, your ID card. You hand it to the president that's running the electoral site. Checks your picture, make sure it's you, gives it to the technician who runs this machine, punches in your numbers, your information comes up, they can see it's you, you put your thumbprint, they see it's you, the president of the table is sure of who you are, pushes the button and unlocks the machine. There's a huge amount of redundancy here. There's just no chance the wrong person votes. This system is 100% accurate. Actually, after Maduro's election, usually they audit immediately 53% of all the machines and check the paper receipts, which I'll show you about. After his election, just to try to calm the opposition, they audited 100% of the machines, and these things do not make mistakes. So the president pushes the button, it unlocks the machine, which can't accept votes until it's unlocked. There's an electronic ballot laying on the table there. You choose who you're voting for. Like I said, there are many parties. The top 12 here are all a coalition that supports Chavismo. And the opposition parties are down here below. You press which one you want, it comes up on the screen. You have 6 minutes to vote. It takes less than 2 to do the whole thing. You have 6 minutes. And then the machine spits out the results of your vote, so you can check and make sure it's correct. You fold it and you put it in the box. And then, as I said, 53% of these are recorded, are audited immediately. You break open the box and with all the parties there, they witness, they pull them out, they count it, they match it up with the machine results. Nowhere in the world is this done. Nowhere in the world is anything like this done. So if you audited 8%, you eliminate any possibility of significant fraud. This is the National Assembly building, and that's what the election was all about in December to elect a new assembly. This is the closing rally of the Chavista candidates in Caracas. Thousands of people. They thought they were going to win. That's President Maduro. There's his wife, who was a candidate. She did win her seat. And this is... the revolution are enthusiastic. They're organized, they're enthusiastic. They thought they were going to win this one too, like they've virtually won every other one, but there's some kind of a disconnect. They didn't realize that discontent among people, that people just, what basically happened is 2 million people that usually vote Chavista just didn't vote. And the opposition voted en masse. And the celebration went into the night. And I would talk to people and say, well, how do you think the election's going to go? They all say, we're at the closing rally? Do you think we could lose? They thought they were going to win. This is a commune we visited. It's actually set up in the Constitution that to facilitate people are organized, particularly in the working class areas. 200 families in a communal council, and groups of communal councils organized together in communes. This is the commune. El Panal, that's like honeycomb. They said, we're like bees building a honeycomb. And this is our delegation with 4 of the women who are leaders of the commune. And this is a local TV, they have a small local TV station, small local radio station. These are throughout the country, these tiny little radio stations. Typical apartment building. This is election day. People find in their name. Instructions reminding people how to vote. More voters. This is a member of our delegation. He is a Caracas native, and after you vote, you dip your finger in indelible ink, which is just another redundancy built into the system, so nobody could vote twice. But nobody can vote twice; it's impossible. More voters. By the way, 74.5% turnout for legislative elections, with 97% of people registered. So, I mean, in our last legislative election, I think it was somewhere 35–40% turnout. By the way, this is a bad picture, but this is that's the secretary to the United Nations going to vote, Rafael Ramirez. He used to actually have the petroleum industry. Bad picture, all arms, but that's President Maduro at the top on his way to vote, right there. Now, outside the voting centers, Chavistas would have a little canopy set up, and their campaign workers would be there, and they encourage people, their supporters, once you voted, come over, sign your name off so we know you voted. Very enthusiastic. They all thought they were going to win. They all wanted to talk. They all wanted to tell us why they were going to win. People are showing they all voted. Happy, friendly people. This is the opposition canopy across the street. Nothing happened. A couple of these people over there are actually people from our delegation. Nothing happened. You could see why they thought, well, we're going to win. The opposition didn't even campaign. All they did is put out literature saying, we need change. Most people who voted for the opposition don't even know who they voted for. The Chavistas campaigned door to door. People that voted for the opposition largely didn't even know who they were voting for. They were just voting their discontent. This is Chavista youth out campaigning and doing work of getting people out to the polls. But here's the result. The mood, the opposition coalition, 167% of the deputies, 67%. The SUV, less than a third. By the Constitution, if you have 2/3 of the deputies on paper, you've got a tremendous power. You can kick out the vice president, you can kick out the ministers, you can throw out members of the Supreme Court, you can throw out people from other branches of the government. But as you read the Constitution closely, it's a little more complicated than that. They're not going to be able to do everything they want to do. So, by the way, the change that they talked about, they didn't say, they put out no program, no platform. Right after they were elected, the guy who got elected president of the National Assembly said, well, we want to stop these pensions, because they've been, every week, thousands of people, older people who have not qualified through work for Social Security, they've been giving them pensions. They get the minimum wage as their pension. He said, we're going to do away with that. He said, we want to close Chavez's tomb up there and get rid of that. He said that we want to do something about this housing situation and maybe kind of get these apartments into the real estate market somehow, et cetera, et cetera. So people started to realize, oh, maybe it's not going to be the change that we wanted. Anyway, it was a huge, and nobody more surprised than them that they won this victory. Believe me, these people were ready to go back out, to tell the people to go back out in the streets and start burning stuff again. They were as shocked as anybody. And for about 2 days, everybody was just like, what the hell happened? It was very, very interesting mood. But after a couple of days, things started happening. And the Chavistas started reorganizing and analyzing what the hell went wrong, and they realized we had some kind of a disconnect here. We need to reconnect with the people. We need to reorganize and strategize and how we're going to keep this from being a total disaster. This breaks it down by parties. This is the opposition bench here, but you can see it's month 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 different parties. Oh boy. Okay. I'm going to try to hurry through this. This is people upset. This is the hot corner where people talk politics down in the office. People being very upset with the results. The new leader of the assembly threw out not only the old pictures of Chavez, but even of Bolivar. That's a Bolivar three-dimensional portrait they smashed up and threw out. So the question is, will Chavismo go away? Are they defeated? I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you I'm getting messages from people in Venezuela over the last several days about what's going on. Some people think we needed this kick in the pants, but things just weren't quite working. And one friend of mine, I said, I'm very concerned about the future of the children of Venezuela and all of Latin America and the world. How many chances do we have to try to build decent, sustainable societies on Earth? I think we're coming to the point where we got to do this thing. And he said, listen, Venezuelan people are a rebellious, revolutionary people. And he said, and don't forget, Rondon hasn't fought yet. Remember the story about Rondon? He said, Rondon hasn't fought yet. And when he does, the Venezuelan people will win again. And that spirit is starting to build. So I'm cautiously hopeful they'll find a way to stave off disaster. But the plan is, yesterday the opposition leader announced that within 6 months they figure they'll be rid of President Maduro. Any elected official in Venezuela is subject to recall after half of their term. In April will be 3 years of a 6-year term, and there will be the possibility of a recall election. And they're planning on trying to get rid of him. So we don't exactly know what will happen. So I'm got to be done because we're out of time. This was Chavez's last words to his people: unity, struggle, battle, and victory. He said we have to stay united. So whether Chavismo will stay united, I can't say for sure. Maybe we've got time for some quick questions if anybody has any. Yes, sir.
With the society that Chavez created, almost like ostensibly a Shangri-La, the way you describe it, why is there so much opposition?
Because of the hardcore opposition, they just want things the way they used to be, which is where they ruled, no part black man would be run. The more prosperous levels of society are white. They really resented a mixed blood person running their country. But the discontent right now with the economic situation, the scarcity of goods, the inflation. For instance, I was changing a dollar for 850 bolivars. The day after the election, that all of a sudden fell to 650. So all of a sudden my money in my pocket was worth about 3/4. It just gave me a slight sense of what it's like for the people to not know what their money is going to be worth, to not be able to save money because in a few months it'll be worth a lot less. And also there's a media attack. There's psychological warfare going on against the people, telling them nothing's working, you have no future, et cetera, et cetera. So basically,
Sounds like this country.
Excuse me?
Sounds like this country.
Right. Well, our systems have problems. They don't guarantee us a reasonable, healthy, peaceful existence, and until we come up with a situation where we can guarantee that we're all going to be all right, we're going to have trouble. Yes, ma'am.
I find it interesting with all your pictures, and I appreciate your program, but my question is, CAFTA, Central American Trade Alliance, I don't see where that was brought in at all. Is Venezuela not part of CAFTA?
Not CAFTA because it's not part of Central America, for one thing. It's part of South America. There was a move, kind of like CAFTA, to have a broader Latin American trade agreement, and that was basically defeated largely with Venezuelan support in our organization.
Thank you.
Anything else? Gary?
Do you think, don't you think that the discontent's going to continue when, unless oil prices rise? Because, I mean, they're not going to have any money.
Believe me, even if Chavez was alive, it would be hard times, you know what I mean? It's a big problem.
It will now be discontent with the oligarchies part.
With the new guys in the National Assembly, you mean?
Yeah, maybe, unless Maduro's going to end up catching the blame for it.
Yeah, well, say they kick Maduro out and get a right-wing president and things are still going bad, I think there'll be discontent. I mean, I know there's already people who regret their vote. But yeah, I mean, the situation for, like I'm saying, the economy's distorted. It's not a healthy situation. People don't produce things. It's been like this trickle-down economy of how we're going to distribute the oil money. Everybody's living in the city. Nobody's in the country producing. The capitalists do not invest in the country in any kind of production. Their capital goes out for speculation, or into the black market. So, and Chavistas have known this. Chavez known it. They got to change. They got to get off the oil economy. But easier said than done, particularly when you're in crisis. Chavez had a plan. I've got a copy here of Plan de la Patria. This was you're supposed to, when you run for president in Venezuela, you're supposed to submit a plan for the development of the country. Chavez, he wrote out this huge plan, how we're going to develop the country, how we're going to change. Okay, but it's a long-term plan. This was a 6-year plan. They've had nothing but crisis. The next thing that happens is he dies, and everything goes to hell. Attacked by the U.S., attacked by the oligarchy, attacked in the media. Oil prices go. I mean, nobody was expecting. They thought they were being cautious. They were getting over $100 a barrel for oil. They were budgeting at 50. They thought they'd build plenty of slack into the system, and it goes down below 30. So the economy is long term. It can't go on. Not and provide for a healthy lifestyle for people. It just isn't going to work. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that the economy is part of Chavez's problem. He said he was going to fix a lot of things, but he didn't change anything on the petroleum. Why didn't he go farther in his plan?
Well, in this plan, there are steps towards that. But it's like you can't just change a thing like that. I mean, the country's absolutely dependent on that petroleum income. It doesn't change in a very short
But how
time.
long was he in office?
He was in office, let's see, from 99 till 2013.
It's a lot of years.
Yeah, but remember, during that time, he was kidnapped, they had a coup. There was also a top-down oil strike where the oil executives shut down the oil industry. So there was no petroleum being produced. The economy went into severe recession. The U.S. has been maneuvering against him ever since he was in. So he had lots of problems to deal with. He did encourage investment in industry, etc., and planned for that, and increases in agricultural production. But these things don't change overnight. For one thing, they need some people to move to the country. Hard to make those kind of changes. And, certainly there may be some things he could have done better. But he was doing a lot of things. The guy was busy. Doug.
Let me ask, has anyone in the Venezuelan government studied the situation in Nicaragua? I mean, you've been in Nicaragua. One of the things you discussed was how the Sandinista government there encouraged farmers, instead of growing cotton for export, grow beans, rice, corn, grow food that people can eat. And is that something that eventually could be done in Venezuela, where they could grow more milk?
Well, see, the difference with Nicaragua is the population of Nicaragua is still largely rural peasant farmers who work on the land. They might not grow very efficiently, but they're growing food. Venezuela has a tremendous agricultural potential. They've got rivers all over the place. They've got plains. They've got arable land, but they got nobody living out there, to produce. They're maybe running some cattle or something. But it's a different situation. But I'm glad you brought up Nicaragua because there's some parallels. I was in Nicaragua in 1990 as an official electoral observer to the presidential election, where Daniel Ortega unexpectedly lost the presidency of Nicaragua. So there's some parallels there. Totally nobody expected it to happen. Lost the election, stayed out of power for 16 years. 16 hellish years for the Nicaraguan people. Some people are wondering, well, what does this mean? Are we going to have a period where the right wing is going to rule and have the presidency? And will they keep the democratic... part of the thing is defend the Constitution so that democracy stays. So that if this does happen, they'll be able to get back in the future. Yes, ma'am?
Several times you mentioned your delegation. Were these local people from the Brainerd area?
No.
And what was the purpose of your trip
Yeah, these people were,
or your goals?
organized out of a group in New York. And it's people who basically wanted to be there for the election and that largely, supported Chavez. And the reason I went with them, I hadn't planned on it, was I'd forgotten that the law had changed and you now need a visa. And I was running up with short time to try to get a visa, and the Chicago consulate wanted you to come appear in Chicago in person at least once to try to get a visa, and I didn't have very much time. And the guy running this delegation could get a visa real quick because he had personal contacts at the consulate in New York. So that's really the reason that I went with them. I was with them for 10 days, but then I was on my own for 10 days as well.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Two things. Does the change in the election change their health care in any way? Or can the Constitution that they have protect that people's power? And how does the election change United States relation with Venezuela, if at all?
Well, as far as the last point, won't change it at all until the government is changed. I mean, the United States funds the opposition. Everybody knows it. You can read the congressional record. You can find out we have millions of dollars to the opposition. It's illegal. It's illegal in Venezuela. But I asked Tanya, the rector of the electoral council, I said, Tanya, the United States gives millions of dollars. That's illegal, right? Why don't you do something about it? She said, well, remember, CIA are not stupid people. They don't just write them a check. She said the money is all laundered. It's hidden. We really are powerless to do anything about it. Your first part was about health care, and is that endangered? Yeah, one of the things that Alup, who is the head of the National Assembly now, he said he wants to get rid of the Cuban doctors. The right wing hates the Cuban doctors. I was in the hospital, saw some people with the infant with burning, raging fever, and they said, without the Cuban doctors, our baby would die. In the old days, our baby would die. We'd never afford to see a doctor. The average person never saw a doctor. He wants to get rid of the Cuban doctors, but as you say, the Constitution says that people have a right to health care, and that is the responsibility of the government. The Venezuelan doctors, they won't take care of the people. They've proved that in the past. They have no interest in it. They want private practice. They want to make a lot of money. So I believe that if they try to get rid of the Cuban doctors, that the Supreme Court, if they don't replace the Supreme Court justices by some maneuver, would say, you can't do that because it violates the constitutional right of the people to health care. So there are going to be huge constitutional, there already are. Actually, 3 members of the opposition have been challenged in their electoral victory because of vote buying. I've seen videos, people are handing out money in the streets. And so they said, we're going to put those 3 on hold until it's investigated. But the head of the assembly went ahead and signed them in, swore them in anyway. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was invalid, and that as long as they were seated, no action that the assembly took was legal. So yesterday I withdrew, and he said, okay, I'm unswearing them in until that gets resolved. But there's a whole bunch of constitutional legal battles, all kinds of maneuvering going on, and all kinds of opinions about what's going to happen. And nobody seems to know for sure, but what everybody's sure of is class conflict is intensifying and coming to a head, and it's going to be a very, very interesting time. President Maduro gives a State of the Union speech tomorrow, so interesting to see what he has to say.
Do they have a good tourist base there, or isn't there much tourism? Do they have a lot of tourism?
Actually, there is substantial tourism that's increased in recent years. A lot of Latin American tourism, but tourism they've got a beautiful country, marvelous beaches, beautiful jungles, waterfalls, a large system of national parks. But a problem in the country, another problem is crime. With the economy being in upheaval, you just can't get a handle on the crime elements. And so for Americans, I don't think it'd be your first destination if you wanted to just totally relax and feel like you were safe. Anything else? Okay, well, thanks a lot for listening.